history of tribes from the southeastern and eastern United States. And tonight we're going to be talking about Indian removal. Let me share my screen here and we will get started. Okay. So, start. Okay, just want to make sure that you can see the slide presentation.
Yep, it's clear.
Okay, great. Um, so this is a complicated story, and more complicated than you'd probably imagine. Um, we're going to focus on the broad scope of Indian removal during the late 1820s and 1830s. And then at a certain point, we're going to focus on Cherokee removal, which was just one piece of a bigger national project. The Cherokee themselves, in their own language, call this really tragic time Nunda da Ulsunyi, which means the place where they cried, or the trail where they cried. And so this talk has been titled The Trail Where They Cried after that Cherokee phrase. For Cherokees who were not removed, they have a different word for this event, and they call it the Great Disturbance. There were a few thousand Cherokees who managed to stay in North Carolina, and they are known as the Eastern Band today. So over the next 50 minutes, I'm going to tell you a big story about Indian removal, and then we'll spend the last part of the talk focused on the Cherokee and their experience. The Cherokee were the largest removed tribe. And then we'll get a little bit into the legacy of Indian removal. So Indian removal, as I said a second ago, was a national project, not just a Southern issue. The Cherokee on their Trail of Tears were the largest forced removal group. And there were more Native Americans removed from the South than from other parts of the country. But tribes were removed from Iowa, from Illinois, from Michigan, from Wisconsin, from Western New York, from Indiana, from Ohio, from Virginia, and from Kentucky. Those groups were mostly smaller. The Cherokee, there were about 16,000 Cherokees removed. There were about 12,000 Creeks removed, about 8,000 Choctaws, about 6,000 Chickasaws, and then smaller numbers of these other groups. Here on this slide, you can see the list of the removal treaties. So the Constitution says that treaties are the law of the land and that tribes cannot be removed from their territory without their consent. But these treaties were signed by tribal citizens, but mostly not by members of tribal governments. And tribal governments had a nation-to-nation relationship with the US Congress, and the US Congress ratified treaties, mostly in the Senate, that often were signed by tribal citizens who were not parts of their tribal governments. This is kind of an unknown bit of this history, especially after 1834. Each of the treaties you see listed here were ratified through coercive means, and the chiefs and tribal members who signed them were not parts of their tribal governments. And this was a huge national issue. We're going to get into some of the reasons behind this, the economic and social reasons, and we're really going to get into the super deep history of why Americans wanted tribes removed. And to be clear, when the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830, it was the most hotly debated issue in American history up to that point. It was very equally divided, and the Indian Removal Act only passed the Senate by 5 votes. Only by 5 votes. It barely passed. And we know that Andrew Jackson and members of his presidential administration used coercive means to get senators to sign on. We're going to get into those issues, but to really understand why Indian removal happened, we need to go back, way back, to 85 million years ago. This may seem ridiculous, but I want you to look at this map in the upper corner of the slide here and get accustomed to that sort of shape, that sort of line. This is the ancient coastline of North America 85 million years ago. The oceans came all the way up into estuaries in Kentucky, into Arkansas, into central North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And they were mangrove swamps. These sorts of swamps pictured here, and as ocean levels receded, because 85 million years ago it was much warmer even than it is now, sea levels were higher. Mangrove swamps were this transition zone between freshwater and saltwater, and this creates a really nutrient-rich environment. And as ocean levels slowly receded, they left layers and layers of decomposing mangrove swamps. That is a key piece. We're going to put a pin in that for just a second. Just get used to this coastline shape going all the way up into Tennessee and along the Mississippi and over into southern Oklahoma. This was the ancient coastline, and as the oceans receded, they left behind these layers and layers of decomposing mangrove swamps. It's very important to the story. This is called the Black Belt. It is a band of rich soil across the US South. As those oceans receded, which took millions of years, they left layers and layers of super rich soil. And by the time that the first human beings were moving into this part of the country, over 17,000 years ago, these became really dense forests. In the far south, they were pine forests. Further north, they were really rich oak forests. And Native Americans moved into these really expansive forests growing in really rich, thick, dark soil. In fact, all of the United States east of the Mississippi was one massive forest until the arrival of Europeans, and Native American populations thrived in this area. By the 1200s, the southeast of the United States was one of the most densely populated regions of the world until the arrival of Europeans. Fluted point technology originated in this part of North America before much of the rest of the continent was populated. There's a complicated story about humans or how humans arrived here, but they came down the west coast from Asia and then crossed the narrow isthmus of Central America and populated the Caribbean islands in the southeast before a lot of the rest of the continent of North America was populated at all. They developed hunting technologies with spear throwers and then later with arrowheads. And there's a lot of really rich soil here on which they could also plant wild seeds. And over time, they domesticated a lot of different things. In the southeast, squash was being grown as a major crop. Then we have the arrival of tomatoes and peppers from South America, and ultimately corn around 1200. This area of rich black soil that you see in the black and white map here also became a band of densely populated cities. There were over 100 indigenous languages spoken east of the Mississippi, and just in the southeast, there were over 15 major cities that rivaled Paris and Rome in the 13 and 1400s. They were massive stone cities uh, with stone buildings, uh, different types of architecture. We had athletic fields, we had shops where you could buy arrowheads, shops where you could buy produce, and Native Americans thrived here for over 17,000 years. Indian removal happened 200 years ago. We are just now reaching the 200-year mark of the origins of Indian removal as an actual process. So it's important to understand this history and also understand this band of rich, dark soil that facilitated these massive Native American populations in the Southeast. We also need to consider the beaver. 15,000 years ago, when there were still humans here, there were giant beavers. They could be 7 feet tall, as you can see in this image here. In addition to the mangrove swamps decomposing, we have beavers living in these southeast forests who build massive dams and dam up creeks and rivers, which leads to deposits of rich alluvial soil. So on top of the layers of mangrove, we end up with layers of beaver dam deposits. Beavers were seen by Native Americans as being very important spiritual beings that protected and conserved water. And so they were immensely important in the Native American societies that thrived all along the eastern half of the United States, which was densely populated with beavers prior to the 18th century. So keep in mind all of these things that leave behind really rich soils, especially in the Southeast. Then we're going to jump ahead a few thousand years, well, really about 16,800 years to the early 1800s. So I am a professor here at the University of Georgia, and our first university president in 1785 all the way through 1816 was a man named Abraham Baldwin. Abraham Baldwin he was a Yale graduate, and he envisioned the University of Georgia as a Yale of the South. In fact, the first building on campus here is an exact replica of the original building at Yale, and it is now the dean's office. Um, Abraham Baldwin was very invested in slavery, very invested in the expansion of plantations. And when he was president of UGA, he was also one of the state legislatures, basically a state senator. Um, Georgia at the time went all the way to the Mississippi River, including all of Alabama and Mississippi. And some of the state legislatures, not Abraham Baldwin, but some of the other members of the state legislature in Georgia, actually engaged in some illegal land speculation where they began surveying and selling Creek and Choctaw land in the western part of Georgia. Abraham Baldwin sort of turns in these people engaged in this illegal land speculation in 1795. And finally, in 1802, those men who were illegally speculating in tribal lands are in a Supreme Court battle to keep themselves out of prison. Abraham Baldwin negotiates with President Thomas Jefferson in 1802 an arrangement that will keep all of those illegal land speculators out of prison, and it will pay off all of their debts to the people who invested in their illegal land speculation. And that arrangement was to cede all of the land west of the Flint River, which is now the western border of the state of Georgia. Everything that's now Mississippi and Alabama was ceded to the federal government under Thomas Jefferson. The other part of this arrangement, however, is that the federal government would agree to remove all of the Indians from the state of Georgia as soon as possible. Now, that's an arrangement made unconstitutionally because the federal government is not supposed to make treaties or compacts with states, but Thomas Jefferson does it anyway. And the 1802 Compact with Georgia is the first piece of legislation that sets the stage for Indian removal. Alabama and Mississippi are divided into territories and eventually become their own states. And Georgia has a standing arrangement with the federal government that the Indians will be removed from the state of Georgia at the federal government's earliest convenience. That's in 1802. Under Thomas Jefferson, we have a whole array of issues. There are several things we need to cover here to get to the Louisiana Purchase. First is the Haitian Revolution. Following the example of the United States and then the French Revolution, wealthy plantation owners in Haiti basically start a democratic revolution. But Haiti is unique. Under French rule, Haiti actually produced more sugar on slave plantations than any other colony in the Caribbean. And so Haiti, this red area at the end of the island of Hispaniola, was the bank for first the king and queen of France and ultimately Napoleon, who takes power during the French Revolution, a whole complicated history there that we don't need to get into. But also in Haiti, it was not unusual for plantation owners to have children with female slaves that they owned. And under French law, even though these black children were bastard children, they could still inherit their father's plantations. And so we have a lot of black French plantation owners in Haiti who own black slaves. And Toussaint Louverture, the man pictured here, was a leader of the democratic revolution in Haiti. He freed his slaves, and actually, the revolution ends up running most of the white people out of Haiti. Haiti had about a 20-to-1 free, for every single free French white person in Haiti, there were 20 enslaved African people. And so when the democratic revolution, led by free black men like Toussaint Louverture, gets in motion, he frees his slaves, and other black men like him also free their slaves. And this leads to a racist revolution in which most of the white people are run out of Haiti. This means that the bank of the French government is now in the hands of freed slaves. And Haiti's revolution in 1791 has historically been portrayed as a slave revolt, when in fact it was led by educated men who were reading Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence and declared their own independence based on those same ideals from the Enlightenment. But it's portrayed as a slave revolt because they were mostly black, free people who won this revolution. Napoleon is spreading democracy through warfare across Europe, and he needs this money. He made 3 attempts to retake Haiti, and he failed at every one. And he's running out of money to wage his war in Europe. The French actually controlled this huge swath of the middle of North America, west of the Mississippi, called the Louisiana Territory. And Napoleon approached Thomas Jefferson and said, "Hey, Thomas, you want to buy the Louisiana Territory for $15 million?" And Thomas Jefferson, unconstitutionally, made an agreement with Napoleon, sent Napoleon $15 million, and Napoleon sent him a document saying the United States owned the Louisiana Territory, which includes this entire red area west of the Mississippi. Here we have the second piece that sets up Indian removal. Not only do we have an agreement with the state of Georgia to remove the Indians, now we have land west of the Mississippi to remove them too. Just as all this is happening, we have a new invention that becomes really common. Cotton was already an important product in the plantation South, but it was only a certain type of cotton that could be grown, needed a really long grow season, and could only be grown in the very southern regions. Part of the problem here is that other types of cotton that could grow shorter, grow more rapidly in a shorter season, had tiny little seeds that were really hard to pick out of the cotton. And if you burst one, it put this green liquid all over the cotton and ruined it. The cotton gin, which was actually invented by a enslaved man owned by Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney acknowledges this. The cotton gin was invented by a slave that he owned. Eli Whitney got the patent because enslaved men had no rights to get a patent. The cotton gin makes it really easy to pick those tiny seeds out of the cotton without bursting them, and it made this short staple cotton, which could be grown more quickly in cooler climates, a very valuable new product. It also means that this rich band of soil through the South becomes some of the most valuable land in the world. The cotton economy is really taking off. The United States is already a major cotton producer by the early 1800s. After the cotton gin becomes a common tool on plantations, that rich soil where Native Americans have been living for 17,000 years becomes coveted by plantation owners. Thomas Jefferson had a vision of populating the United States and of including Native Americans. He called this coexistence. He believed that if we could teach Native Americans how to farm, even though they were better farmers than Europeans to begin with, if we could teach Native Americans how to use plows, how to use horses, how to be civilized people, that they would just become Americans. And so Thomas Jefferson didn't really think through what it meant that he made this arrangement to remove the Indians from Georgia, because he believed that the Indians in Georgia would just become like white people. And he believed it would happen in just a few generations. He did not understand that Native Americans valued their culture as much as they did. And they also valued very much their attachment to place. For Native Americans in the Southeast, especially, but all over the country, their cultures grew out of the relationships to the plants and animals and rivers and mountains of the places where they lived. And so Native Americans were very attached to this place. And in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and North Carolina, especially, we have large Native American populations living on really valuable land who are deeply attached through thousands of years of culture to their place. Then we have a series of events after Thomas Jefferson's presidency is over. Andrew Jackson is a general in the US Army. When, um, no, this is complicated, so I don't want to get out in the weeds too much with all the details here. But I imagine that many of you have heard of Tecumseh. He was a Native American leader, a Shawnee chief, and he traveled all over this area west of the Appalachian Mountains, recruiting Native Americans to join in his anti-colonial movement. Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa argued that if Native Americans abandoned European influences, stopped using plows, refused to use plows, stopped speaking English or trying to learn English, and instead stuck to their tribal cultures, that they could defeat the Americans and stay where they were. Tecumseh, between 1811 and 1814, built a pretty strong alliance with the British. Tecumseh lived here in this little spot called Prophetstown with about 3,500 other Native Americans of multiple ethnic groups. Americans are really invading Ohio and Western Kentucky, Western Tennessee, and these unceded lands in the South. And so Tecumseh believes that if he can get all of these groups to work together, they can hold back these illegal colonizers coming from America. And he gets the ear of King George III of England and King George III, who still is humiliated by his loss in the American Revolution, is very interested in taking back his American colonies. So King George III supports Tecumseh. He offers him weapons, he offers him supplies, he offers him military support, and Tecumseh travels around the West trying to recruit other tribes to join his mission to defeat the Americans with British support. When Tecumseh comes to the South, he gives a talk among the Creeks, and a lot of groups, including the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, all come to hear Tecumseh's talk. Now, a real quick history here. The Cherokees had fought against the United States during the American Revolution and on the side of the British. And actually, a group of Cherokees fought the United States until 1794, when they were massively defeated and an army of about 2,000 Cherokees was massacred by the US in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Major Ridge had fought against the Americans in the American Revolution when he was a teenager and in his early 20s. And after that defeat, he saw many of his family members and friends killed by the United States. And when Tecumseh came and gives a talk in Alabama, Major Ridge goes, but not to join Tecumseh's uh, rebellion against the United States, but to tell Tecumseh that the Cherokee would not join, and if Tecumseh came into Cherokee territory, Major Ridge would kill him himself. Major Ridge actually creates a Cherokee and some of the Creek Indians alliance with Andrew Jackson. And so we have a war that breaks out between different tribes allied with the British and different tribes allied with the Americans fighting with Andrew Jackson. Now we know of this as most commonly as the War of 1812. But this actually starts as a rebellion, as a civil war among the Creeks. A lot of traditionalist Creeks wanted to join Tecumseh. In 1811, Tecumseh came and gave a talk among the Alabama tribes and said, "When I return home, I will stamp my foot on the earth, and the earth will shake. And that is a time to start our revolt against the Americans." Now, here it's important to understand that while all of these natives allying with Tecumseh are agreeing to give up European influence, they refuse to give up one thing that they get from Europeans: guns. They're getting guns from the British, and they have guns that they had received from Americans and from the British, guns that are sometimes by 1811 30 or 40 years old that have been maintained because they're really valuable among Native Americans and well cared for. What happens is that these traditionalists, well, let's step back here a second. The cotton economy is really valuable, and tribes like the Creeks own massive amounts of this really valuable, rich soil in the South. And so a lot of Creeks, a lot of Cherokees, a lot of Choctaws, a lot of Chickasaws actually own cotton plantations and own slaves. And these more wealthy and more economically engaged Native Americans become the leaders of their tribes, while the vast majority of those tribes are more traditionalist and do not own plantations, do not own slaves, and do not engage with this global cotton economy. So, what we have is basically a division between intertribal divisions, right? Where Native Americans who are more traditionalist are being supported by the British fighting against the United States. And the United States is allied with the slave owning members of these tribes. Tecumseh comes, he gives his talk. He goes back to Prophetstown in Indiana. Notice the name, Indiana, the land of Indians. This is how that state gets its name. It is the center of a massive Native American alliance that includes traditionalists all the way into the deep South who live on this rich soil. And then we have plantation owners who are allied with the cotton economy and with the Americans. And this turns into a Creek Civil War known as the Red Stick War. And it really takes off because just a few months after Tecumseh gives a talk in the summer of 1811, he goes back to Indiana, and there's one of the most massive earthquakes that Central America has ever experienced. It was a 7.2 on the Richter scale. It happened at a small town called New Madrid on the west side of the Mississippi, was the epicenter, and it flattened that town. The Mississippi River ran upstream for an afternoon. It actually changed the course of the Mississippi River. There's an area of northwest Tennessee that has a lot of huge oxbow lakes that used to be connected to the Mississippi River. This earthquake in 1811 separates them, and they're no longer part of the course of the Mississippi. The Red Stick traditionalist Creeks take this earthquake as the sign that Tecumseh talked about. They believe that it's the fulfillment of a prophecy. And so there's a massive uprising among the Creeks that explodes into the War of 1812 between traditionalist Native Americans in the western part of what was then the United States along the Mississippi River. Those traditionalists are allied with the British. And then we have the wealthier, more engaged with the cotton economy tribal leaders in the South who are allied with the United States and Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson leads this army that's about half Cherokee and Creek warriors fighting against other Creeks and Chickasaws. There are several battles, and you can see the battle sites here in the South. Andrew Jackson and his army, which includes a lot of Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama militia fighters that are white settlers, as well as thousands of Cherokees and Creeks, all fighting against traditionalist Creeks, traditionalist Choctaws. Very few Cherokees actually fought on the British side. This is a bid by the King of England to retake the colonies, and he actually does invade Washington, D.C., and burn most of it down. He's actually winning the war in the north. Tecumseh is actually killed in a battle in Lake Erie, and that sort of collapses the Prophetstown alliance. Prophetstown itself is destroyed by William Henry Harrison. The Americans are winning in the North. And then ultimately, the Americans win in the North after Tecumseh is defeated. And Andrew Jackson is winning every battle in the South. One of the most important battles there and the final defeat of the traditionalist Creeks is known as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Andrew Jackson and about 1,500 Cherokee and Creek warriors actually defeat the last remnants of the Red Sticks. It's a really incredible story. Major Ridge himself was crucial in winning the battle for Andrew Jackson. Another Cherokee named Junaluska actually fought directly alongside Andrew Jackson during this battle and would later famously say, "I wish I'd killed him when I had a chance." The Cherokees actually believed that by fighting with Andrew Jackson, they'd be allowed to remain on their land. But as soon as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend is over, Andrew Jackson coerces the Creeks, many of whom have fought alongside him, into ceding all of this territory in Orange. It's most of the Creek territory. And you will see in the next map that this land cession that's most of Alabama actually separates the Cherokees and Creeks from the Choctaws and Chickasaws. And because he's now defeated, uh, the United States has now defeated the Prophetstown Alliance in Indiana. This battle signifies the end of any pan-Indian alliance that could possibly defeat the United States. And this also seeds a lot of really rich black soil that's great for growing cotton so that it can be turned into plantations. End of pan-Indian resistance and the expansion of the slave South. And in Europe, this turns into a way that the French and the English are sort of dividing up democracy around the globe. But we don't have time to get into that. After the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, a lot of Red Sticks and a lot of escaped slaves flee into Florida. Florida was Spanish territory until Andrew Jackson illegally invaded with a largely untrained army of state militia fighters from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. He does not actually invite his Native American allies to invade Florida because he knows that he's going to be fighting mostly runaway slave and Seminole warriors. And the Creeks and the Seminoles are really closely related, and in fact, you could argue that at a certain point they're the same people. Andrew Jackson did not invite his Native American warriors to participate in his illegal invasion of Florida. In fact, he did not even tell the President of the United States, James Monroe, that he was invading Florida until after he had won his first battle. Andrew Jackson was a respected military leader by his soldiers, and they just followed him wherever he went. And he illegally invaded Spanish Florida. He destroyed a set of forts, destroyed numerous Seminole villages, and actually forced the Seminole into South Florida. And at exactly this moment, Spain is dealing with democratic revolutions in Mexico, Colombia, and Bolivia. And so they don't have time to deal with Spanish Florida. And they basically say, wow, Andrew Jackson is kind of insane. And we don't have time to deal with this. And we also need money to fund our wars to keep our colonies in South America. So let's sell Florida to the United States. And it's somewhere around $10 million in money at that time. That would be billions of dollars today. That the United States government purchases Florida from Spain because of Andrew Jackson's illegal invasion that was a war against Seminoles and escaped slaves from southern plantations. All of this is setting the stage for Indian removal. So you can see here just a quick look at the expansion of the United States and the expansion of US cities. These areas in black are urban populations. And over the next 25 years after the First Seminole War and the War of 1812, the American population expands rapidly. And you can see how rapidly they expand into this really rich band of soil across the South. We only have a few major urban areas in the South because most of the South is plantation land, where you have a huge house. There are about 15 plantation houses still standing here in Athens, Georgia, where I'm talking to you from right now. But in the North, things are different. Slavery is not profitable in the North because you can't grow cotton that far north. You can't grow tobacco that far north. You can't grow the kinds of crops that enslaved labor makes profitable. So in the North, we have more rapid industrial development during the 1810s and 1820s. But one of the most rapid expansions is in cotton mills in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York and New Jersey. Cotton mills rely on cotton that's grown by enslaved labor in the South. There's no longer a chance for Native American alliance, which can resist American expansion, and the national cotton economy is becoming the driving force of the American economy. So, as the plantation South expands, industrialization in the North that relies on the production of the plantation South also expands. This means that the North is not off the hook in terms of why Indian removal happens or in the expansion of slavery in the South between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. Here you can see this is an image of a plantation house here in Georgia in Savannah, about 4 hours away from where I am. There are numerous houses just like that here on campus at the University of Georgia and in Athens. This entire part of the state was plantation land. And in fact, where I am in Athens was named Athens because it becomes a booming city in the 1810s. It is an economic center in the plantation South, and it is on the borders of Creek and Cherokee land. New York City also expands rapidly during those same 25 years from the end of the War of 1812 until about 1845. New York City is a center of global finance, and it is central in the banking that is funding the expansion of the cotton economy, not just among northern cotton mills, but also among the expansion of the plantation South. In fact, the bank that was established here in Athens, Georgia in 1824, that was dealing with some of the most wealthy people in the world at the time who owned plantations right here in Athens, was called the Bank of New York. And that building is now a sushi and taco shop. But the vault downstairs is a bar. This was the Bank of New York, and it was right here in Athens. The financial center of New York City was essential in the expansion of the Plantation South, and the Plantation South was essential in the expansion of New York as a financial center and in the industrialization of northern states. At exactly this moment, we also have the Second Great Awakening, an expansion of lots of different denominations and of people who go to church. And this creates hard divisions between the North and South, because in the South, churches create justifications for slavery and racial hierarchy, while in the North, we start to see an abolitionist movement that is anti-slavery. Here's just a quick look at some of the growth of the cotton economy. And then in 1828, some illegal miners in the Cherokee Nation of North Georgia discovered gold. That's kind of the last pin drop before a rapid expansion of support for removing the Indians from the South. Georgia extends state law unconstitutionally over the Cherokee Nation, divides the Cherokee Nation up into plots, and gives those plots out to white settlers well before the Indian Removal Act is passed. Dahlonega, which is here in Georgia, is a Cherokee word that basically means yellow rocks make white people crazy. That's what Dahlonega means. It becomes the most productive gold discovery in North America at that time before the gold rush in California. And there's a mint, a federal mint established there that is producing gold coin. And this just increases the wealth and increases the motivation behind Indian removal. Andrew Jackson becomes president at exactly the moment that this gold is discovered. He holds a public party at the White House for his inauguration. You can see his ghastly looking self here. By the time Andrew Jackson became president, he was really unhealthy. He had bad teeth. He had a bullet lodged in his chest from a duel that he won. He coughed all the time. He spoke really low. He kind of was low energy, but he was an intelligent guy, and he's deeply invested in the plantation South. He was himself a slave owner, and he wanted this to expand. And so one of the first things he does is talk about expansion to the West. He gives lots of speeches about why it's important for America to expand to the West, not just for the South, but also for the North. And he garners a lot of support and wins the presidency in 1828 by the first landslide election in U.S. history at that point. One of his first major acts is passing the Indian Removal Act. It basically says that it's best for the Indians if we round them up and force them west of the Mississippi because white settlers are often drunk and bad influences, and these poor natives, they've proven to us now that they can't actually be civilized. So the best thing for them to do for their survival is to move west of the Mississippi. We have solid evidence at this point that he actually pressured several members of the Senate to vote in favor of the Indian Removal Act, using promises for bills that they wanted passed, using illegal funding, basically bribes, to fund projects in their state that these senators wanted. And he gets the Indian Removal Act passed by 5 votes. So now we're going to focus on the Cherokee. You can see the shrinking amount of land that they claimed. This red territory was what Cherokees claimed at the very beginning of the 18th century. By 1819, this is all that's left, but it does span 4 states: North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. Most of the Cherokee Nation is in Georgia, and gold is discovered in this region. The Cherokee had developed their own alphabet in the early 18 teens, and by 1825, 90% of Cherokees could read and write in their own language, and most of them did not speak English. This facilitates their ability to really organize against Indian removal, and they publish Cherokee language articles alongside English articles in their own newspaper. The English article might say, "Wow, we're worried about Indian removal." The Cherokee language article would say, "Hey, we have to organize and resist. We can't start a war because they will kill us all. But if we organize against them, we might win." So the Cherokee government gets 2 cases into the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides in their favor. One of these cases concerns missionaries. This man here, Samuel Worcester from Massachusetts, was preaching among the Cherokee Nation with the Cherokees' permission, but he was in the state of Georgia, and the state of Georgia had illegally extended its laws over that segment of the Cherokee Nation, and so they arrested him, sentenced him to 2 years of hard labor, and he and a group of lawyers from Massachusetts sued the federal government. Around that same time, the Cherokee Nation sues the government of Georgia for illegally extending its laws. In both cases, the Supreme Court decides basically in favor of the Cherokee. But Andrew Jackson and his acolyte, Martin Van Buren, who took over in 1838 as president, decided to ignore the Supreme Court, which up to that point was unprecedented. And there's only happened 3 times since then. We don't have time to get into that. At the same time, lots of Cherokees start to realize that if they want to survive, Andrew Jackson is probably right. They need to move west. So we have divisions among the Cherokee. The Ross Party, which supports the missionaries staying in their territory and supports the Cherokee resisting removal using the Supreme Court's decision in their favor, versus the Treaty Party, including Major Ridge, who had fought alongside Andrew Jackson. Major Ridge knew Andrew Jackson personally, knew Andrew Jackson would not give up, and he decides that he and his son John Ridge and their close friend Elias Budnot should work with the governors of Georgia and the presidents of the United States to sign a treaty that allows the Cherokee to have land west of the Mississippi to survive. These are the two Supreme Court cases that are decided in favor of the Cherokee that Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren ignore. This is the illegal treaty that Major Ridge and his son sign. They had a meeting with a U.S. federal negotiator, and only about 250 Cherokees show up out of 16,000. And only 16 Cherokees sign this treaty, none of whom are members of Cherokee government. They include Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Budnot. After the removal treaty is signed, the United States sends the army. They start organizing. They establish all of these removal forts, which are essentially concentration camps. They round Cherokees up into these concentration camps, sometimes for 8 months at a time. This is Fort Butler, Murphy, North Carolina, where I grew up. It was a massive removal fort. About 8,000 Cherokees were rounded up here, a large number of the Cherokee Nation from the mountains. Many of them starved to death, died of dysentery, less than a half a mile or a few miles from their home. This is the original map for Major General Winfield Scott, who later goes on to become a Civil War hero. And they round Cherokees up at gunpoint, force them into these forts. This is a painting by a Cherokee artist representing the removal process. This is the Cherokee version of the story from this territory. But this also happened to the Creeks. It also happened to the Choctaws. It happened to the Sauk and Fox. They are rounded up at gunpoint and forcibly removed. The Seminole continued to fight until 1845, but a large group of them are removed in 1832. They are removed to what is now Oklahoma. And if you've kept up with the news, in 2020, the Supreme Court actually decided that most of Oklahoma is actually reservation land promised to these removed tribes, while the state of Oklahoma had denied that reservations existed within that state for over 100 years. So there are a lot of moving parts to this. And it is a really tragic event. About 2,000 Cherokees die on the Trail of Tears, which they call the trail where they cried. Lots of other tribes are removed. There's a total of about 40,000, maybe 50,000 Native Americans who were rounded up by the military and forcibly removed to Oklahoma. Not just the Cherokee, but the Cherokee account for about a little bit more than 1/3 of the total number. And that's why we think about the Trail of Tears as this forced removal. But again, this included tribes from Western New York, from Michigan, from Wisconsin, from Illinois, from Indiana, from Ohio, from Kentucky, as well as from the southern states. But the impetus for this act really comes from the expansion of plantation slavery and the cotton economy, which was a nationally valuable issue. Here we see the rapid expansion. 1830 is right here, and look at how cotton production expands once all of that rich black soil made from decomposing mangrove swamps 85 million years ago and from tens of thousands of years of beavers damming rivers and creating rich alluvial soils. That soil is turned into cotton plantations as soon as Indian removal is over. This makes the United States one of the most wealthy and powerful nations in the world because of all this money and because of places like New York investing in making this land into plantations and developing the cotton economy and industry in the North. The United States becomes the economic powerhouse that it has been ever since. Now remember that shape? These are my last couple slides and I'll take some questions. If you look at how this works, these are the number of slaves percentage of the total population. And this is exactly the shape of that mangrove swamp coastline 85 million years ago. One thing that often gets forgotten about is that all these tribes were removed from the South and sent to Oklahoma, where there were already thousands of Native Americans. So we have a lot of conflict there. And in a lot of ways, you can think of Oklahoma as a really violent place from the time of Indian removal through the end of the Civil War because of all these tribes, some of whom owned slaves, some of whom had nothing to do with slavery. This creates a really violent microcosm of the Civil War happening in Indian country. By 1840, this is what the United States looks like. Texas is an independent state reliant on cotton plantations. It's the western edge of the Black Belt. These slave states include some of the most wealthy people in the world, along with bankers in places like New York and Philadelphia. And here we see various maps that show the same shape of the ancient coastline. The slave population of the South at the time of the Civil War, the percentage of cotton production in this bottom map in the green, and even in 2008, the counties in the South that tipped the scale towards President Obama's election in 2008. That's this shape, the Black Belt. Also, right after Indian removal, we have a massive expansion in Indian wars that lasts from the 1830s really until 1890. So I will stop there. I'm happy to take questions. I know we covered a ton of stuff in a relatively short time. I will stop sharing here and maybe I can see some of the questions you're asking.